Evolution, of course, as told to us many, many times, is the change in allele frequency over time. We really wouldn't know what evolution really is if it wasn't for Charles Darwin. Before him, we went by a theory called Lamarckianism, which stated that traits acquired during the lifetime of an individual were passed on to its offspring. So, for example, here we have a giraffe with short neck, and it can't really reach the tree branches, so it stretches and stretches its neck until finally it's able to um, get a longer neck driven by inner need, which allowed it to eat the tall leaves. It would then pass on those traits. That, in fact, is not true, because Darwin then came up with the theory of natural selection, where stating that there were giraffes with short necks and then there were giraffes with tall necks. And as seen here, we can see that the tall neck giraffes would then be able to eat the leaves and the short neck giraffe wouldn't be able to reach. The fitness of the tall giraffes here would thrive and they would have a greater fitness than the short necked giraffe, which would die and go extinct due to it not being able to eat and reproduce. So the long necked giraffe would survive. Now, natural selection occurs, of course, in the population, not in individuals, as the individual organisms did not experience change in allele frequency over time. So, just like in the Lamarckianism theory, um, the individual does not change its allele. It might stretch and grow bigger muscles, but it's not going to pass on those alleles to its offspring. Different examples of Darwin's finches, of course, of natural selection is Darwin's finches, where he studied a certain finch that lived on different islands in the Galapagos, and he noticed that each of those finches were the same, but they had different beaks. And of course, that would be because they evolved due to the food that was available on those particular islands. This really helped drive the theory of natural selection because it really proved that depending on their environment, over time, animals will evolve to thrive in their environment. So, depending on whether they're eating fruit or seeds or insects, these finches evolved their beaks to help them thrive. Also, with the peppered moth in Europe, before the Clean Air Act passed during the Industrial Revolution, everything was covered in soot. The air was covered in or filled with smog, so everything was dark. The trees were covered in soot, so there was a dark moth, which actually was a recessive trait. It seemed to thrive because it was able to camouflage into the darker environments, and thus it did better in that environment. And natural selection then preferred it because it would be harder for the prey to pick them off. And vice versa, once the Clean Air Act passed, lichens began to grow on trees. The soot came off the trees, and the skies cleared up. So the light moth then was favored in natural selection, and we saw an influx in the light moths. Now, in natural selection, there are patterns and there are processes. Just like in the example before, the pattern is there was an influx in light-colored moths. The process was because natural selection preferred the light-colored moths against the clean air and the clean trees and the lichens, which were lightly colored. Additionally, here we have a pattern that shows the beetle color is different on two different sides of the mountains, and we can measure that pattern. It's something that we can see. So we can measure the color, we can measure the frequency. Now, the process is why it happens. Natural selection favors brown colors in the desert, and it also favors green colors in the mountains, because beetles that match their backgrounds and avoid detection by predators survive, of course. So once again, patterns is what it is, process is why it is. Now, modes of natural selection, there is directional selection, where one extreme phenotype causes the average and phenotype population to shift one direction. So when we're talking about beak sizes, let's say if there is only nuts available, a bigger beak size would obviously be favorable to eat those nuts. So the shift would shift over to the right to the big beaks. Stabilizing selection favors genotypes near the middle of the range. Let's say there's only seeds available, and a small beak couldn't break the seeds. A big beak wouldn't really be able to hold the seeds, and because it's too bulky. So the middle genotype or phenotype would win out. So the average would suck in towards the middle. And of course, these two directional stabilizing genetic variation is reduced, because it's like the other two would be less common now. And then there's disruptive selection, favors extreme phenotypes at both ends of the range. So let's say there's leaves and fruit available. Both the small beaks would thrive and the big beaks would thrive. The middle beaks wouldn't be able to get the leaves fast enough, or be able to break the big seeds, so they would kind of start to die off, and the genetic variation is increased because there'd be more separation in the genetic variation. And then there's also balancing selection. So no phenotype is favored in all populations of species at all times. So maybe during the winter, leaves are not available, but seeds are. During the spring, there's leaves. During the summer, there's fruit. So nobody ever really wins. So the genetic variation is, of course, maintained. And then we move on to sexual selection. And then there's intersexual selection, where it's between species, not between species, it's between sexes, so between male and female. The females are choosy, and they will choose their mate based off of, it can be their feathers, or their calls, or a certain dance. And then there's also intrasexual selection, where males will compete amongst each other to mate with females. So inter is between, intra is within the sexes. And then there is primary sexual traits. Of course, that's the sexual organs, what is directly related to reproduction and the fertilization of zygotes. And then there's secondary sexual traits. They differ between the sexes, but are not related to the fertilization of zygotes and directly related to reproduction. These can be antlers, their behaviors, their mating calls, their mating dances, their horns to fight with. All of that stuff would be the secondary sexual selection. Genetic drift. It's all about chance, and it happens all the time. It's always happening. It's random fluctuations in the number of alleles in a population. An allele may increase or decrease by chance over time. And in this illustration here, we can see a great example of natural disasters, flood, fire, which cause population bottleneck. There's also founder effect, where different some of the population will migrate over and colonize in a different area. Further explained here, the founder effect, we see that here we have 4 different phenotypes, and a couple of them moved over and migrated and colonized randomly. But the allele frequency is not the same as the ancestral population. We have 1 orange, 2 brown, and no white, where here we had a good even mix. So over time, the frequency of these alleles will be different than their ancestral population, and some can even be completely deleted in the new population. So the white butterfly there might not ever show up in the new population. And then there's also population bottleneck, which again is completely random. It can be something like, for example, a person stepping on a colony of bugs, and we have blue, red, and green bugs here. And so all of a sudden the population ceases, and only a few survive and then start to reproduce, and a new population and the population then grows and grows and grows. Now, as you see here, by chance, none of the green ones made it. So the new population is just blue and red in a completely different proportion as before. Before we had a pretty good mix of red, green, and blue, and now we only have blue and red, blue being the obviously dominant allele there. Moving on to gene flow, it is the movement of alleles from one population to another. It occurs when individuals leave one population and join another and breed. Here's a really good example. We have a western deer population, an eastern deer population, and we have a mountain range in between with, of course, a pass. Some deer from the eastern population move over. It will then mate with the eastern population here, from the western to the eastern. And over time, these populations, the differences between these two populations will actually, the genetic difference will decrease because they will become more similar over time. So the genetic difference between the two will decrease, and within each population, they will increase in genetic diversity. So you see here, you can see that the diversity is a lot more diverse than it probably was before these two from the western side got there. So they'll mate, they'll start producing new offspring. Mutation. Mutation increases genetic variation. Mutation introduces new alleles into every individual in every population in every generation. Mutation is random with respect to fitness, so it can be either beneficial it'll have no effect. But more often than not, it's usually deleterious, especially because populations are usually well adapted to their surroundings. So introducing a new allele usually isn't a good thing because it probably won't thrive or won't help the that organism thrive in its environment. Mutations tend to have a big effect, of course, on organisms with short generation times, such as bacteria, so prokaryotes, because they reproduce and regenerate very quickly, unlike eukaryotes or humans. Even just, for example, mammals, we reproduce once every couple years, maybe, where bacteria is reproducing every couple minutes, even every couple minutes, basically. So we saw this as a great example when it comes to the resistance of penicillin. Bacteria would mutate to develop a resistance and would quickly begin to regenerate, and that mutation would be passed on to each generation after that. And then all of a sudden, after just a few short generations, the entire population of bacteria is completely resistant to penicillin. That's why we have to change penicillin and antibiotics, and we have to change them constantly to keep up with the mutation of the bacteria to be resistant towards these certain antibacterias. Now, without mutation, there would be no genetic variation because it introduces new alleles in individuals and in populations. We see that well, we know that the natural selection and genetic drift usually lose genetic variation, and so does gene flow. It mostly lowered genetic variation. Mutation really increases that genetic variation and adds new alleles into the gene or into the population pool. So without it, evolution would really just cease to exist. And that is it. Thank you very much, and good luck with finals. Thank you.